Hey, co-reporters. I really want to talk about the adoption drama that Teen Mom stars Catelynn and Tyler are going through right now. Their case is, in my opinion, a deeply complex and troubling case that raises serious questions about the legality and ethics surrounding the adoption of their daughter, Carly, and the adoption industry as a whole. The video isn't about who's right or who's wrong. There are no bad guys, only victims. Catelynn and Tyler are victims of an abusive childhood that scars them for life and a fundamentally broken adoption system that preys on people like them to fulfill their role in providing children to people like Brandon and Teresa, whose lives have been scarred by the pain of infertility. Carly, their adoptive daughter, also bears some scars from the trauma of being adopted, as briefly mentioned by Brandon and Teresa in an earlier season of the show. Adoption is a very complex industry worth an estimated $1 billion in the US alone, where parents can spend $20,000 to $50,000 per adoption, depending on the race, age, and sex of the child they choose, and the legal fees associated with adoption. This topic alone deserves its own hours-long video, but I'm going to stick to the topic at hand and focus on Catelynn and Tyler's particular situation. The pair were only 16 years old, living in poverty and navigating a tumultuous upbringing when they were faced with the heartbreaking decision to place their newborn daughter, Carly, up for adoption through Bethany Christian Services. This was an adult decision made by two kids without parental consent or a lawyer to serve as representation. So, was this adoption predatory? Was it even legally valid? And what recourse do they have now? Join me in discussion with New York-based lawyer Dmitry Shaknovich of the YouTube channel D-Shak Law as we unravel the layers of this troubling story and examine the legal and ethical dimensions of an adoption that may have been flawed from the start. We are joined now with Dmitry Shaknovich of the YouTube channel D-Shak Law to discuss the situation because it seems like this very well could become a very complicated legal matter if either Catelynn and Tyler or Brandon and Teresa chose to take it down that avenue. So before we get started with your opinions on the case, Dmitry, can you tell us a little bit about your experience as a lawyer?
Sure. So I do primarily practice law. I don't do this primarily, although this is great and I love to do it. My main job is representing clients in courts, New York, New Jersey, sometimes other places. And I do criminal cases. I do family cases. So I'm well versed in topics such as these. And I also have a YouTube channel that folks can subscribe to if they're interested in pursuing some extra knowledge or something of that nature. It's at D-Shak Law. And www.dshaklaw is my website where you can find a whole lot more about me and contact me if you need for any reason at all.
Perfect. So you guys, I do have a link to Dimitri's YouTube channel, and I'll have a link to his website as well in the description box of this video. So you did mention, Dimitri, that you worked in family law. You work in family law. Do you have any adoption cases that you manage or have managed in the past?
I have in the past. I don't at this point. They're extremely rare adoption cases, right? Because really the only time folks come to me is when an adoption is contested, which happens virtually never. So they're very rare.
All right. So you guys, there's so much to discuss here. Catelynn and Tyler, they were teenagers raised in poverty by abusive, drug-addicted parents when they got pregnant at 16 years old with their daughter, Carly. They were forced to give her up because their home wasn't suitable for a child. But they were always clear about wanting annual visits with their daughter, regular communication, photos, etc. And they even expressed this multiple times on the show. Their adoption counselor agreed to it. The adoptive parents agreed to it. And to Brandon and Teresa's credit, they did keep up with the communication and the visitation for quite a while, up until this year, it seems. And so Catelynn, she released some text messages online showing that Teresa stopped responding to her messages and she seemingly blocked her as well. And so I'm kind of wondering, Dimitri, how all of that kind of, plays into an adoption agreement. Were those terms legally binding, or is that separate from an adoption agreement? I've heard that there might be a communication agreement. I'm not too sure. Is Teresa well within her rights to block Catelynn and Tyler from having communication, given that there was an agreement there?
Well, when you talk about one's rights, you're talking about what a judge would do in court. And when it comes to these kinds of cases, and by the way, this is applicable in child custody cases and visitation cases, all kinds of family-related cases. you're really talking about the best interest of the child, right? So if this were to go to court, a court would ultimately determine, obviously, the agreement and prior orders and judgments issued by the court. Those all matter, but really it's the best interest of the child, right? And typically, the best interest of the child dictate that all interested people, right, all loved ones, are involved in the child's life. And so the judge and the court are always interested in balancing those two things together. And that's the analysis that would be undergone here.
Speaking of the courts, I do actually want to kind of take a step back and look at the adoption overall. So just as a reminder, Catelynn and Tyler were 16 years old. This is a photo of them at the hospital when Carly was born, when they went through all of this. So, first of all, when it comes to contracts and minors, have you heard of these sorts of cases? Like, what do you feel about the legality in general, given their ages at the time?
All of these cases, when you're in family court, are extremely sensitive for this very reason, right? The court is interested in protecting the confidentiality, the interests of kids, right? They typically will assign lawyers for free for the children, not to mention things like social workers and forensics folks and therapists, everybody to ensure that for the children, that court process is undergone seamlessly, right? Without any real problems. And it's because of that courts can issue decisions and rulings on a child's life, right? Because they put in place all of those protective measures throughout the process to make sure that the child isn't robbed of any rights or any obligations to the child by the legal system.
Mm-hmm. And so the children in this case are Catelynn and Tyler. Are you speaking about them being offered legal counsel as they were undergoing this?
In every court proceeding, they are. Right. And again, I should qualify this and say that I practice in New York, so different states can do this differently. But the last thing a judge wants is to have any order vacated, right? To be reversed, to have appellate efforts undertaken, to have objections undertaken. And so that effort, putting lawyers in place, making sure that people are assigned to protect kids is important to prevent that from happening in the future, right? From being challenged. That's what judges are interested in doing, right? Doing enough to make sure that they're not challenged down the line.
I agree. And so Tyler did actually speak out about the representation that he and Catelynn did or did not receive. And he said, and I quote, "The only time we had any kind of legal representation was when Bethany, which is the Christian services that handle the adoption, provided us a guardian ad litem to give us the permission we required since we were minors and our parents were not going to do it in order to terminate our parental rights." So does that sound like the court did its best to fulfill that sort of obligation to make sure that they were protected as minors?
So a guardian ad litem is another person in that system, right? That the court can impose as somebody that will make decisions in the best interest of the child, right? Mm-hmm. And again, that's just one of the parties involved. The guardian ad litem isn't necessarily the lawyer, right? It's somebody else that can handle financial questions, that can handle other questions that matter for the kids, right? And so that's exactly right. The court will do that and put those folks into place.
Mm-hmm. So just to clarify there, a guardian ad litem is not necessarily a lawyer, which means that if this is the only person that they received as counsel and it's not technically a lawyer, then technically they never had legal representation.
Well, it depends, right? The guardian who is responsible for speaking out for the kids may have conveyed that the kids, for whatever reason, don't want a lawyer, right? And some judges will overrule that desire and say, well, it doesn't matter, you're too young, and we're going to assign you one anyway. But it really is a fact-specific analysis, right? Mm-hmm. So a guardian ad litem shows me that there was somebody assigned by the court to protect these kids in some way.
And do you feel like that was enough due diligence? Or do you feel like there should have been a lawyer appointed to them, just given the situation and how young that they were? Because, it's seeming like they didn't really fully understand, which is, I get, given their ages and what they were going through. It seems like they didn't really understand and that a lawyer probably would have been a better option to provide them with.
What you're saying sounds right. It really depends on the facts of the case and what was going on in that courtroom. Right. Mm-hmm. Judges make these rulings for a reason, right? They assess the facts and circumstances of the case and the law that applies to those facts and circumstances. So they must have felt for whatever reason that what they did is sufficient. some judges will go above and beyond and assign lawyers and do everything they can. And some will say, look, the parties are mature enough or have been advised well enough or are in the know well enough that we can forego certain aspects of the litigation process.
Okay. Wow. It's very interesting because I didn't even know what a guardian ad litem was, to be honest with you. So it is rather interesting to get, the kind of like the proxy information there. So just one last question on this topic before we move on this particular point. So if Catelynn and Tyler now, given that they're in a different place in their lives, right, that now they're in their 30s, they've gone on to have more children, and if they were to contest this in any way, could this be a point for them that, hey, like we felt like we were not given a proper counsel, the highest level that we could have been given at the time? Like, have you heard of adoption cases like being fought to be overturned, anything like that? Do you think this could be a point for them?
It possibly can, right? But again, judges don't like reversing, especially themselves, and they don't like vacating their own decisions. So assuming the record is sufficient, assuming that when these adoption orders were issued, they were issued in sound law, right? Then it'll be hard to make those kinds of reversals. That's not to say that they can't happen. That's not to say that you can't make motions and do other things to try to make that happen. But generally speaking, look, courts like finality. They don't like reinvestigating closed cases.
I agree, especially when it comes to children. At this point, Carly is in her teens. She's been raised her entire life by this family. So it would be rather difficult to go back from that. It's just out of curiosity. And now, speaking of the handoff, I want to talk about something that was really famous here from their 16 and Pregnant episode. Because Catelynn's mother refused to sign off allowing her to adopt out her daughter, she could not do the handoff here in the hospital. Here on the right-hand side, you see Brandon and Teresa, who are the adoptive parents, carrying Carly for the first time, but they could not officially walk out with her as their own daughter because they did not have the permission from Catelynn's parents. So the exchange had to take place on a parking lot, like a nearby parking lot. So can you talk to us a little bit about what that might mean in terms of the legitimacy of all of this? To me, it feels very strange that if a guardian was provided to them, proper counsel, proper representation, that they wouldn't be able to do this handoff in a hospital without Catelynn's mom's permission.
That's right. And look, courts really have to account for these things, right? That's why we have them, so that orders can be issued. And I don't know specifically what happened here, the timelines, the facts and the circumstances, and that would be important. But the reason we have courts is to account with real specificity as to what happens as to the rights of these kids and these adults, right? When what is supposed to happen and how and under what circumstances. And so what you're saying sounds a little strange, but again, it really depends on how this all went down.
And so when it comes to the communication that was requested in the adoption agreement, when Catelynn and Tyler were choosing an adoptive family, they said, we want an open adoption. We want to be able to send and receive photos every year. We want to be able to send gifts. We want to have annual visits. And this family agreed to those terms. But now it's seeming like they no longer want to comply with those terms. Is there anything that Catelynn and Tyler can do here, legally to enforce the terms of the adoption?
They can, and I'm assuming what will happen is the opposition to those efforts will say that there was a certain change of circumstances, right? Something is different now than it was before for whatever reason. And then the court will have to, again, balance what's in the best interest of the children. So that's how these analyses typically take place.
And you guys, if you're just joining, once again, I am joined by Dmitry Shakhnovich of D. Shak Law. He is a New York-based lawyer who's here to answer all of our pressing questions about the Catelynn and Tyler's adoption drama featuring Brandon and Teresa. And so you do touch on a good point there, Dmitry, which is that some sort of circumstances must have changed. So what are the level of circumstances changing that would justify Brandon and Teresa cutting contact with Catelynn and Tyler? For example, Tyler these days, he posts, well, both of them, but he is the model. They post content on a website called OnlyFans. And some people speculate that that might have caused some of the issues with the adoptive parents. Would that be reason enough to cut off communication? Like, what are the sorts of circumstances that a judge would deem appropriate?
it's funny that you ask that, because that's what clients ask all the time. The best interest of the child test that I've been kind of beating you over the head with is vague, and vague for a reason, right? Nobody knows what that really means. But what we do know is there are certain factors that are taken into consideration. So the child's development, the child's education, the child's involvement in the community, the child's own desires, right? When a child gets old enough, they can voice their own desires, and those have to be taken into account by courts. So it could be really anything, right? There's no designated list, and there's a reason for that, because every case is so different.
That's true. That's true. Now, when it comes to the ethics of this adoption, again, given the status of Catelynn and Tyler in life, being that they were young children. And, when you watch the 16 and Pregnant episode, you see that Catelynn is severely abused by her mom. Her mom, she calls her, all sorts of profanities, pretty much every scene that she's in with her. She's smoking her in her face. She's really, really abusive to her. And it's quite difficult to watch. So when you look at the circumstances that they were facing, would you consider them as having been in duress with like no real option here? Do you think that this was kind of like a predatory adoption? Do you have any kind of like overall high level opinions about this, just based off the information that you know?
Well, what I do know is adoptions can be terminated, and they weren't, right? Which means that something else is going on here, and that means that for whatever reason, nobody undertook that effort yet. And sometimes folks do. Right. Sometimes kids are emancipated, not only from their adoptive parents, but from their biological parents. Right. Courts handle those kinds of things. They didn't handle them here. So for whatever reason, there wasn't sufficient necessity, I suppose, or maybe there was some fear or something else going on that prevented that from happening.
Can you tell me a little bit more about this? Adoptions can be terminated. I personally have never heard of an adoption being terminated. So I'm really, curious to know how that would work.
Well, an adoption becomes a parent-child relationship, right? And a parent-child relationship can be terminated by courts. It's called emancipation, right? You can go to court and petition to try to be emancipated from your parents, or perhaps somebody on your behalf can do that, right? And the reasons for that are obviously all of the usual reasons that you can imagine. Obviously, the age of the kids matters, and other things. But you can terminate an adoption, and you can effectively emancipate yourself from your adoptive parents, and you'd have to file petitions and hold hearings in court to see whether or not that's necessary.
Wow, that's very interesting. And I do want to ask you about a case that I saw that came out of the Supreme Court of Nevada back in 2002. I just saw it a couple of minutes before I hopped on live with you, so sorry to ambush you with this. But basically, and I'm going to see if I can share the screen with you, but it's on caselaw.com, and there was something that went down where a birth mother sued the adoptive parents for her child because it's similar to Kate and Ty. There was a communication agreement alongside the adoption agreement, but she wound up losing because the court said that the communication agreement was not legally binding. Only the adoption agreement was legally binding. And so she tried to appeal. The appeal got shot down as well. But here on Case Law, they talk about how, kind of like, ethically speaking, it's unfair to, tell someone who is about to adopt out their baby, everything that they want to hear, and turn around and say, actually, technically, I don't have to do this. So my question there is, do you see this kind of potentially going down that same route?
It's very tough for courts anywhere really in the country to force parents and kids to do anything outside of their parent-child relationship, right? So when an adoption takes place, the adoptive parents become effectively, obviously, the legal guardians, legal parents of the minor child. And then it becomes very, very difficult to force them to communicate with other people outside of that relationship, right? And that's always the balance, right? The rights of parents versus the rights of others. And whether or not courts can strike that balance in an effective way. And there are public policy concerns with making it mandatory for years on end to have kids of an adoptive family communicate with their biological parents, right? That's an interesting analysis, as you can imagine. So these are difficult questions, and sometimes courts are reluctant to enforce those kinds of agreements and those kinds of approaches.
So when the reluctance, is that in terms of how the child might be feeling? Perhaps the child might have complicated feelings about their identity, adoption, and need some space from the birth parents in order to process that. Are those the cases that you're kind of referring to there?
Well, it depends, right? There are some ways in which there are just black and white letter law that says that, look, you can't really jeopardize adoptive parents' rights in that way. And then there are other instances where the best interest of the child test will rule, right? And they will say that for whatever reason, if a parent who raises a child who adopted the child at a young age deems a decision appropriate, then you have to follow that decision because parents have rights.
Mm-hmm. So who can they appeal to at this point? Would Catelynn and Tyler, in order to address the situation, now that they've been blocked by the adoptive parents, would they have to go to Bethany Christian Services, which is the adoption agency? Would they have to have a lawyer and, go lawyer versus lawyer, in Brandon and Teresa's camp, the adoptive parents? What are the next steps from that for them if they want to, really officially handle this outside of social media?
Well, generally, the way this works is that you have to make an application in the lower court, right? It's called different things in every state. And then if they deny your application, then you get a certain period of time to file your notice of appeal, your intent to appeal, and then appeal to the higher courts. And there are also ways in which you can file objections and other motions to try to vacate prior decisions and prior court rulings. So that's what they'd have to do. They have to work their way up the courts.
Okay. And so, one of my last questions here. Thank you so much for joining us again. So once again, you guys, I am joined by Dmitry Shaknovich of D Shak Law. He's got a wonderful YouTube channel where he discusses all things legal, whether it's legal news taking over in politics and the celebrity world, or I believe you also just talk about the law in general as well, right? So anything law related, head over to the D Shak Law YouTube channel or go to D Shak Law's website. It's dshaklaw.com. Correct me if I'm wrong.
That's right.
Perfect. So now, lastly, Catelynn and Tyler have been very outspoken about all of this on social media, and I'm wondering if that can impact the outcome of this situation. Can Brandon and Teresa claim that Catelynn and Tyler are violating some sort of agreement by, blasting all of this on social media? Can they say that they're feeling a little harassed or whatever it might be? Because that's some of the pushback that they are experiencing on social media, and I'm just curious about it from a legal perspective. Are they well within their rights to talk about their experience on social media as much as they want?
The short answer is yes. Now, there are laws in place, defamatory defamation laws and other laws that will prevent that from happening. If it crosses over to somewhere where there's intent to harm, intent to harass, then you can go to the police and possibly have them arrested. So it really depends. Generally, we're a free speech society, right? So we like stuff to be online. And we like stuff to be in the public forum, as long as it doesn't cross those lines of illegality. And that's what they have to watch out for.
Mm-hmm. So if they are simply telling the truth about their experience and what happened, would that fall into harassment? Like if they're posting about it too much, or is that still free speech?
It shouldn't fall into the category of harassment. But again, it depends. It depends on what's said. It depends on the timelines. It really depends on what's in their head, right? What the intent is behind making those posts and all those comments. Is it to harm, or is it to get their story out? Is it to vent? I mean, it really depends.
Mm-hmm. And so now, can I just ask you, maybe this might not be a legal question, but I'm kind of curious, with you being a lawyer, how do you feel about this case in general? Like, I find it personally to be, rather fascinating, given like their ages at the time and just the complexities involved there. And, the background of poverty, of violence, of, parents who were involved in crime and stuff like that. Like, it is just something that has been gripping me. And I'm curious, how you feel about it from your own perspective.
These cases are so tough. And I know from my perspective in the cases that I do, these cases are so messy. And especially when you involve all of those factors that you kind of just rolled off, it becomes very difficult. Whenever you're dealing with kids in the legal system, it's incredibly difficult. I mean, there's no other way around it. And that's why courts exist, to try to make it as easy as possible. And sometimes they succeed and sometimes they don't.
Mm-hmm. Wow, so well said. Dimitri, thank you so much for joining me. Once again, you guys, this is Dimitri Saknovich of DShack Law. Check out his YouTube channel, DShack Law, or his website, dshacklaw.com, for all things law. So there you have it, a legal expert's take on this complicated situation. At the end of the day, both couples are simply upholding what they each believe to be in the best interest of Carly at this present moment, and we don't even have the full story to go off of. Unfortunately, at this present moment, there is no perfect way to handle communication between biological parents and adoptive children and biological parents within the adoptive system. And the courts have a difficult time forcing communication between adoptees and their biological parents. My takeaway from this interview with Dimitri is that although adoption is not perfect, it strives to act in the best interest of the adoptive child. Up until now, Catelynn, Tyler, Brandon, and Teresa had worked together diligently to honor their communication agreement, traveling across state lines to have visits with Carly, sending photos and gifts to show how both families have grown and progressed over the years. So it's been very strange to hear that all of that has come to an abrupt end for the foreseeable future. Carly is currently 15 years old, 3 years away from being able to manage her own communications with Catelynn and Tyler if she chooses to do so. Will the couple have to wait that long to see or hear from her again? Neither you nor I know the answer to that. We also still don't know the exact reason that Brandon and Teresa decided to cut contact. All we know for certain is that this situation is playing out in the public eye and that this situation has caused pain to everyone involved. I believe that all four of them are reacting to the circumstances in the best way that they know how, and I'm hopeful that eventually they'll be able to mend their relationships. Thank you all so much for taking a closer look at this situation with me, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video.